For those of you that don't know me, I'm John Williams. As of last night, I am the city manager here in West Linn now. Thank you. um, and unfortunately, I was out all last week with COVID, which was awesome fun, but I finally got to experience what a lot of other people have experienced, and it was not fun. And I really appreciate what I was going to do in my intro. It was explain a little bit about how we got here, why this committee exists. You guys did all that last week. I'm happy to answer questions. But I will say this is a new topic for West Linn, and it's one that council has been very interested in pursuing as an option. They, like you, have had to learn about tax increment finance, how it works in Oregon, how it might work here in West Linn. And I know that they very much appreciate your willingness to come together and spend your valuable time on this topic in order to create a recommendation for them about how they should move forward. We on staff appreciate that very much as well too. Citizen involvement is the hallmark of everything we try to do here, and we can't and we don't want to do this without talking to you community members with your diverse perspectives about this topic. So I am happy to answer any of that background stuff about the last couple of years if need be, but I think it'd be a super valuable use of your time to just start working on today's agenda. So again, thank you and welcome, and I will be here until 5 today.
Great. Lynn, do you want to pull up the PDF and it will walk us through the rest of the agenda, starting with the review of the boundary questions, so we can move a couple of slides. Well, let's just go to the agenda and we'll walk through. So one slide down, please, or one page. So we'll review the boundary questions. I think we will not dive into Mr. Schwartz's comments until he's here, but I can talk a little bit about the Lincoln Institute article. Discussion of potential projects and project costs, discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion input from Echo Northwest. Talk about the next meeting and get your valued input on the discussion of projects and financial analysis, and then identifying if there's further information that you want us to provide for you, and then allowing for public comment if there is any. Next piece, Lynn. So this is the boundary, and there were a number of questions about it at the meeting last week. And so I think I'm going to let John and or Darren address those questions, but the questions were based on the reasons for inclusion of the historic West Linn area, the reason for inclusion of that Y triangle up above. Mr. Schwartz wondered whether the boundary should be the same boundary as the riverfront planning area. So those were the majority of the questions. There might have been a question about the furthest end to the right, also about where that terminus is and why. So John, maybe you want to address those 4 questions, and then we'll see if anybody else has other questions on the boundary.
Sure, and Darren, I don't know, Darren and I did not coordinate this, so if you were planning to do this, you can speak up now. First of all, let me tell you what I hope is obvious is that this boundary is a draft. It was a draft for the purposes of studying the issue of tax increment finance in West Linn. It was put together largely by staff to bring basically a concept to the council and to the community for further study. The council was very clear in creating you all as an advisory committee that they wanted to hear your opinion on the boundary and what it should be. The financial estimates and the project list that you've talked to Elaine about at the last meeting and read the materials are based on this boundary, but nothing in that is mutable. The council, if they choose to adopt a tax increment finance district in West Linn, will choose the boundary. It can choose that boundary to be whatever they feel suits the need the best. With that introduction, the boundary was never exactly drawn to reflect the waterfront project. Rather, it was a district of town that was linked by commercial or possibly commercial uses in the general area between 205 or near I-205 and the Willamette River, to be a contiguous area that made some sense, that had geographic, that had physical, that had transportation, that had utility connections, but it was never intended to be simply related to the waterfront vision project. And Darren can talk a little bit more about the waterfront area. I know you covered it some at the last meeting. So really, we looked at areas that were undeveloped, underdeveloped, or had utility project needs that we knew about, infrastructure and utility project needs that we knew about, in many cases, which didn't have complete or any additional sources of funding. So obviously the connective tissue in this boundary really is Willamette Falls Drive. And one of the big pieces of infrastructure that we have struggled to figure out how to fund in order to make this area work is Willamette Falls Drive itself, and making it a safe, functional, multimodal infrastructure facility. That's important. But also providing utility infrastructure that may serve the future development of the waterfront area. We also do have needs that we know about or desires in the Willamette district, stretching all the way down at least to 10th Street, and even into the Willamette district. For example, business and development interests have talked to the city for years about the need for more parking in this area. And were there to ever be a parking structure in the district, that's something that has no known funding source right now. Similarly, when we started looking at it, we have an area across I-205 in the River Falls Plaza area that is underdeveloped, in my view, for the long term, or completely undeveloped, as is the case for the property on the north side of Blankenship Road. So those properties represent, we think, opportunities for this community in the future, opportunities that would probably need to served by infrastructure, increased infrastructure in order to work. So all of that was the foundation for us developing the map you're looking at right now. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer specifically to the map. I think it's more about where you think opportunities are in this community in the future and how we want to have infrastructure funding sources available for them. The one place I didn't address that Darren is more familiar than I by far is the far right-hand end of the map down by Willamette Falls Drive and Broadway and A Street. And if you have questions about that area, Darren can certainly answer. So since I haven't watched your meeting from last week, that may be an entirely amazingly satisfying answer to you, or that may not answer your questions at all. I'm happy to take more questions. Oh, I see. Okay, now I just opened it up. Commissioner Joel Metlin has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Yeah.
That answered some of the questions. I think maybe just for the record, like the clarity on, so do improvements need to be within that area, the map area, to receive dollars from this? And then likewise is, even if there isn't any planned improvement for a specific spot included in the map, I'm assuming you would also have the option to include areas that help increase the amount of potential revenue that would come in to pay for things elsewhere in the map, even if there weren't any improvements in that area. So I want to clarify those two things first. And then second, I think Darren may have to answer the question about, like we've seen things like pedestrian bridge or another bridge that's in the area that's not covered by the map. And so on that far right side, so there's just in my mind a question about that. And if excluding that on a map means that no funding from this could go towards that development, even though that's clearly directly related to waterfront improvements as well.
Yeah, thank you for those. That helps me. That helps me a lot. And nudge me if I don't get all the parts to that. Project money, tax increment finance money has to be spent within the boundary. So that's one obvious answer, is that any infrastructure we put in using tax increment finance needs to be inside the district boundary. The intention and the hope for it is that generally you're looking at an area that needs some support in order to get the infrastructure in, to get the more development to happen, or different kinds of development to happen, in order that you increase the area's value to the community, and in the end return increased tax revenue back to the city and back to the other taxing entities that are underlying this whole area. So getting at your question of, do you only include underdeveloped properties, or do you include areas that have some development? Mostly what you'll see on that map is underdeveloped, or potentially or areas that are increasingly, that could be developed more. Now, obviously, in order to create a district that connects, you're going to see some areas that may never change in the life of the boundary. The last thing you asked is about, I guess, paraphrasing, sort of neighboring projects that aren't fully within the boundary or aren't at all within the boundary. That's the bridge, the bike and ped bridge that you mentioned is probably the biggest example of that I can think of, that's sort of immediately adjacent to what you're looking at on the boundary there. It would be a tough one to include in right now, and although I think you could make a case that a bridge like that would increase the business prospects and the development prospects of some parts down there by the Arch Bridge. And we have people on this call who could probably answer that question better than me, whether it would do that. Right now, that project is a little bit nebulous. I'm happy to talk about it more. So it'd be a little hard to figure out how you draw a map to cover a bridge that hasn't been located yet. And I saw a couple of hands came up.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. Did that get it, Joel?
Yep, you got it.
For now. Okay. And I think Greg was up first, and then Cassandra came up second.
Sure, John. I've got a question about how much development in property close to the river will be needed to meet the projected tax revenues, and where would that development be anticipated?
That's a super question, and I want to answer it in a different way, which I love doing. Not answering your exact question, but answering a different question. What I want to make sure that you and the whole community know, and Darren can pipe up on this, the vision for the waterfront district has not been developed yet, right? And so I don't see this as us creating a thing that we then have to change the community's vision for this area in order to generate a certain amount of revenue. I think that would be the wrong way to approach this. I think we really want to make sure as a community what that waterfront project area should be, through the project that Darren, that maybe John Floyd talked a bit about last week. Maybe not. But Darren could talk about it if you need more answers about it. But I really want to start with that community level of planning for that area. Now, there's some parts of the boundary that I think we have a pretty good sense of what the community wants, but there's some areas that we don't know. I do expect the community will value the waterfront and the natural resources down there. I do see that natural resources down there being a driver of economic development. It'll drive tourism. It'll drive tourists to West Linn to come and watch. And let's say we create trails with viewing platforms and things like that down there. People will want to come to that, and then they'll want to go to the Willamette area and have lunch, or down to the new development near the Arch Bridge and have lunch. Maybe we'll get a hotel someday to balance some of that. So but I think we want to start with what the community wants and then build from there. Cassandra, hi.
Hi, thank you. Congratulations. Glad you're better. So just with the context of the boundary, with Willamette being included, it's a little bit hard to understand how Willamette, downtown Willamette specifically, that's really doing quite well, how that is blighted. And you know how the justification is for the boundary to include that section.
Well, I think I completely understand that. I do think there's more that we would hope to do, like along 8th Street in the future. I think it's an incomplete district to some extent. But your point is, I can't argue the point. And I think it's one area that the council would really like to hear from you all on. Does the Willamette district, is it done? Is it finished? Does it need any more assistance? A lot of people on this call know how we struggle to find revenue to do projects in this community. It took us a long, long time. Jody, how often do we redo Willamette Falls Drive? It takes us 30, 35 years to pull the money to do it. Something like that. So, but I think a recommendation from this group is exactly what the council is looking for. Let me see, was that Kevin first?
Great. A couple of questions. Just a point of order. If, as you said, the design work for the waterfront hasn't carried forward yet, if in the future the district does want to change a little bit, like let's say it does want to extend where there's a ped bike trail all the way under the 205 bridge or something like that, can this be amended? Can this in the future have a process to do that, or are we really like that making it hard to do that?
No, it can, and Elaine's our expert on process like that. So go ahead, Elaine.
So the boundary may be increased by 20% of the original boundary. Anything over a 1% amendment. So if it's 100 acres, you can add up to 1% through a minor amendment, which is just a resolution of the agency. Anything over that has to go through the same process as the original plan. So it's a more in-depth process through the agency, planning commission, county briefing, but it may be extended by 20%. So that could certainly include that acreage if it was desired in the future.
Yeah, okay, that helps a lot. Thank you. And one other thing, kind of maybe for the room, but it is, as I just today went down to Cooperstown to see if there would be a seat available, and the place was packed. So along that, today is somewhat of an example of what would be far from blighted. But as an architect, I can certainly say that if there was an intent to have, dare I say, more density, if there was an attempt to say, let's put housing into that area, let's do some 3/1 things, you know, the incentive would be to say, this is great, we've got this existing, would pick whatever along that row there to say it's relatively, you know, successful at the current incomes and such. But if there was an opportunity to increase the scale, I'm wondering if that is maybe part of the intent here, is the intent to see some scale in that area that might include housing.
I have to answer that question diplomatically. I think you'd get really different answers from really different people. I think there's a lot of folks in town who love it exactly like it is. I love it exactly as it is. I can see that you could do something different. I think that would be a pretty big community process to get there. There was a lot of thought and effort put into the design guidelines and the heights and all of that stuff that's there. I do hear from time to time an interest and a willingness. You know, I sometimes hear from business owners, boy, we'd love to have some people living right along here and more customers and more. But so I think that is not, how about I say this, that is not a project we're working on right now. But that would be one that I think if the community had some interest in, there's probably some pretty great examples out there of how you do it in a way that benefits and not hurts the community. Okay, let's see where I was. I think, was it Mr. Edwards next, and then Jody, and then Jim, and then Greg, I guess, maybe?
Mhm.
So go ahead, Jim.
Okay, well, it seems to me that the process is one in which the city staff is looking for input from us, this committee, as to the boundaries of the area, And then ultimately, either the city council or the voters in West Linn will decide if they want to adopt a tax increment financing program and divert tax revenues to special projects. And so my concern is if we include the Willamette area where development seems to be occurring without a great deal of public support, financial support, and those tax revenues would be diverted from their uses today. So I think we would be, as a city, would incur more opposition to the tax increment financing district, or even the concept, if that area is included.
That sounded like a statement and not a question. So I think that's completely relevant and valid way to look at all of this. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's exactly the kind of advice the council's looking for. Who did I say? Jody next, I think?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jody.
This is sort of a question and a statement. I was one of the people who lobbied to have the Willamette area included, mainly because there's a lot of things that are going to be, hopefully there's going to be ongoing growth in that area in terms of some of the projects that are upcoming. And we want to have the revenues from those projects be able to help fund some of the things that need additional work, like parking structures, some improvements along 8th Street, and especially development of the property that is on the other side of 8th Court, where there's that ramshackle house and a couple of other properties that are really underdeveloped. And so there's a fair amount of things along that area that really can be redeveloped. So I think that, and this is sort of where the question is my understanding is that when you're looking at this district, you want to look at it comprehensively in terms of whether there's stuff that's already going that will add to funds coming into the tax increment district, as well as just areas that are completely don't need anything. I mean, Willamette needs some things, but also some of the development will help pay into it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. That's the same. That's the other side of the same coin. And I agree. The reason we added it is because we do think there is some more work that can be done in there. And I do think that a lot of what has happened there is the result of public investment. Public investment helps. I guarantee you the investment that the city put in through the Willamette Falls Drive project is going to drive private sector investment along the boundary. And if we did similar things on 8th or extended the side streets, or provided parking someday, you'd see even more. So but again, it's just, it's a fascinating question. And I think I appreciate this group bringing it up. I think I had Greg and then Michael, is that right?
Jody actually raised the questions I had about the area just beyond 8th Court. So thanks, Jody.
Oh, okay. So Michael.
Just to follow up on Jody's comment, our Citizen Economic Development Committee met on I believe on Tuesday. Today's Tuesday. We met Thursday last week. We met Thursday last week. We did discuss this boundary. As a citizen committee, we were supportive of the boundary as outlined with the inclusion of Willamette Drive. So that's like just a statement. And we did have some pretty rigorous debate with some of these similar issues that have been raised, where I think we felt comfortable was with the opportunity for interconnectivity of that existing commercial with this future development. And I think we do have alignment with Jody's statement that there are additional projects that could be needed in that area. we felt that a stronger lever potentially to use would be to look at those projects and to be targeted in those projects, and being cognizant of the fact that a lot of investment has gone into Willamette, and perhaps there's a way that we could prioritize projects that are more in that riverfront area that does need significant infrastructure in order to develop. So that's a statement for what it's worth, and just a small piece of the pie. Obviously, there's a lot of important perspectives involved. And then the one question we had to do with Highway 43 corridor in Robinwood, and potential expansion or consideration for expansion of the boundary into the commercial areas, between, say, Merrillhurst through kind of that Robinwood corridor. And that's something that I think would be interested to know if there are plans for that, or that's probably more than 20%. And so I don't know if that would be a new TIF, but I guess the question is, have there been any discussions within the city about that area? And is there any receptiveness about a potential tax increment finance facility in that area?
Michael, thank you for all that. Actually, this is a concept that the city councilors have raised to us conceptually. I guess stepping back, and I may ask Darren to tell you a little bit about it, but we've long had on our minds that Highway 43 through West Linn could be better. It's a real mix of things, and I think its importance in this community, it deserves more attention than it's gotten. And I think, having seen successful corridor development in other places that's in keeping with the community goals, I think we can do some pretty cool things on Highway 43. I think the market is there. I think it will need a lot of public investment. The city council has approved funding or set aside funds for us to do visioning work on Highway 43. Really excited about getting that going. In a moment, I'll ask Darren just to tell you 1 minute's worth of what the timeline is for that. Following that, after they learned more about tax increment financing, at least one of the councilors has asked us, could this work on Highway 43 as well? Our thought was that would be a different project, a different district, really different set of goals, objectives, infrastructure, and I think would certainly require this whole discussion again. Let's see what happens with this one, and then bring back the community, bring back the impacts to taxing entities to have a conversation about whether this is a tool that could make sense on Highway 43. But the message I want to send is that we're really excited about at least looking at Highway 43 and seeing what we can do to help that area succeed. So Darren, just a 30 seconds more on timeline on 43.
Yeah, thanks, John. So we do, as John said, we do have funding from council. We're going to put out the RFP, request for proposals, here in the next 2 weeks. Hopefully having a consultant on board by end of November. And then it would be basically a 2-year project. So to have it adopted in place, any zoning changes by the end of 2024. And this is something that's been on the city's radar for years. 8 to 10 years ago, there was a whole visioning process done for Robinwood, Bolton, and Willamette. So there's already some data and feedback from that time period. So we'll incorporate that into the process.
That is all the hands that I see raised. Since this group doesn't exactly have a chair, unless it's Elaine, maybe, I don't know if you want to hold all of that thought for a while and talk more about boundary later, or whether you want to keep going and see if you can get to some initial recommendations, or you want to carry it over. So I think we're open to ideas on that, and I'll let Elaine run from here.
Yeah, what I might suggest is we bring this back at the end of the meeting after we talk about projects, because that will help us provide some information. And then I have an update on financials, I was able to get our finance team to just look at if we took the Y portion across 205 out of the area, what the impact would be on the tax increment revenues. And that impact, so that's keeping the Willamette area in, but getting rid of the Y section and the boundary. That reduces the overall TIF and capacity by a third. So like Jody was saying, a lot of times when you're looking at an area that doesn't produce any income, like your waterfront area, if you're going to try to get some income in the area, sometimes you do have to include adjacent areas that have some tax increment revenue. The political decision on how much and where is something that has to be wrestled with, and whether it's appropriate. And that's something we'll talk about again here in a few minutes. So if Lynn could bring the PowerPoint back, or the PDF back up, we'll go through some of the other items and then come back. So in the agenda, we did have the review of Mr. Schwartz's comments. We're going to hold those, but I have one thing to say on that, which is I've read before the article that he mentioned. When you download the article, it says you are not allowed to share it. So I can't share it to the city or share it back to any of you because of the way it's contained on their website. So if any of you are actually interested in reading that article, you'll have to click on the link that Mr. Schwartz provided in his comments and get it yourself. So, and I've read that article many times, hadn't read it recently, but it basically looks at tax increment areas in other states, not Oregon, and some of the issues. And I'd be happy to go through those issues once Mr. Schwartz is at the meeting, where he can hear that too. So hopefully we'll be able to do that at the next meeting. So then we'll move into identification of potential projects. When we did this for the feasibility study, staff looked at all of these different master plans, the Willamette Falls Drive concept plan, transportation systems plan, Westland sanitary sewer master plan, the storm drainage master plan, the water system master plan, and the parks and recreation plan. And then just as staff, they had other input on potential projects. So I'll just kind of walk through what some of those projects are. So next slide, please, Lynn, next page. The thing to know is that, and we'll see here, I don't know whether staff had time to come up with recommendations on this list or whether we should go through the list. So maybe John and Darren can let me know, but the list is much longer than the potential dollars that this area would come up with. So the list is just all of those projects that the city has identified that need to be done in the area. And part of the decision making on this plan will be which of those projects do you want included in the plan. So John, should we just walk through those different projects first?
We can do that. I mean, I don't think we want to talk about each individual storm drain project or segment of roadway. I'd be happy to. I can be the color commentary to you as you go if you want at a reasonable level. We can always go through at a high level and then come back to things.
Yep. So next page, Lynn, please.
So what you have, and as Elaine said, what you have here is pretty much every existing project in our capital improvement plans that have a connection to the boundary area. And I've noticed going through it, there is one that is incorrect that we have to pull out because it's Confusingly, in West Linn, Willamette Drive is Highway 43. Willamette Falls Drive is the one in this boundary area. So we do have one sanitary sewer project that I noticed.
That's the wrong place.
Highway 43. It says Willamette Drive. That was just probably my mistake at some point. If I had to tell you which ones are, because I think the question you're most interested in is which ones of these are most valuable in delivering a community vision, delivering economic development in the boundary area. One that I would certainly highlight for you is all of the transportation. The multimodal transportation project from the Arch Bridge to 10th Avenue is sorely needed. I think will be a crucial part of having any development happen in this corridor in order that our transportation system can actually handle any development. Willamette Falls Drive needs to be improved now. It needs to be improved even more so when you think about the 205 construction project and tolling happening. We need to design it and build it in a way that it doesn't encourage cut through traffic. If there's going to be any development along this segment of roadway, we need to really have a complete street. And if you take the time to drive between the Arch Bridge and the Willamette area, you will see there are areas of this road that do not abut areas that are going to be developed. And that road will not be built unless public dollars are put into it. Small sections may, individual tiny properties may develop and build 100, 200 feet of sidewalk and bike lane that they're required to do when they develop. But then you have 3/4 of a mile of area that doesn't have any logical development connected to it. And so if you're going to see development in the waterfront area, I think you're going to need Willamette Falls Drive done. There are funding sources that can help, but there's no funding source identified that's paying for this project right now. We are not seeing funds from ODOT for it. Our transportation SDCs will take forever to save up to be able to provide this project. So if I had to pick one, and I'll ask Darren also to turn on his mic while I'm doing all of this, the multimodal bike and ped project on Willamette Falls Drive, sidewalks, shared use lane, all of that's in the vision that the council has adopted would be on the top of my list, and it's pretty expensive. So right there, you have a project that could easily use almost all the money that a tax increment finance district could put together, I think. Development in this area will certainly need sewer lines, will certainly need improved storm drainage. You see storm drain projects, sanitary sewer projects. These also have sources of funding that exist for them, but are competing with projects citywide. So the problem with system development charges, although there's some highly visible development happening in West Linn, if you drive up and down Salamo Road, you see houses being built. It seems like a lot. West Linn is one of the slowest growing communities in the metro area by population, has been for years. The development rate is really pretty low, even though our system development charges are pretty high. It takes us forever to save up to build substantial projects in this community. And a development of 10 or 15 houses does not get you there. So if we're waiting for system development charge to do this, you're going to be waiting a long time. And I think the theory of a tax increment finance district is you can start building up a funding source that you devote to a particular area, focus investments there, and then reopen the taxation to it. So I think Elaine did give me the assignment from your last meeting to go through this entire list and figure out which ones were very critical for development to happen and which ones might be less. I have not completed that assignment yet. There's quite a bit going on. I think we as a staff could probably do that and bring back some further recommendations. But my initial sort is that you have several kinds of infrastructure. I think the roads are pretty important. And then you have some parks and rec facilities. This gets into the thing I mentioned earlier. If we're using tourism as an economic development draw, then you're going to want some of these facilities to make it an area that's appealing for people to come to. Complements that sort of economic development. And then you'll see we have parking lots to support development. in the project, and a few other in the other category. I'm happy to talk about some of those, but I guess that's my high level view of what is in this project list. Darren, would you add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Yeah, I think the Willamette Falls Drive improvements are probably going to be some of the critical components to making any redevelopment successful.
One thing that's really important to remember about this district and makes it a little unusual, the city of West Linn owns basically zero of the property other than public right of way. So you actually have people on this committee that are related to property owners or are property owners. You have PGE here, Kevin Johnson. You have folks that are familiar with what conditions might have to exist for those properties to do anything over time. West Linn's real tool is zoning and infrastructure. If we want community vision to happen in this area, those are the two things that we have the ability to use. We don't have any property that we own outright that we can just do a great affordable housing development or a great mixed use 3/1 building. We're reliant on the kindness of our private property friends. So that's, I guess, my overview. Oh, Greg, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
Oh, no problem. I just had a question about just the challenge and expense of doing the development on Willamette Falls Drive. Just thinking about the geology of that area and kind of knowing that the whole Camassia area was just scoured clean by the Brett's flood. And I'm just wondering how much impermeable lava are you basically dealing with in that area, and the challenge of kind of digging sewer lines and kind of doing the excavations needed for roads, because I could imagine it potentially being very expensive, and just kind of wondering like whether the revenues from the TIF would be actually sufficient to introduce those kinds of improvements.
Well, we could do a subcommittee meeting because I have a bachelor's and a master's in geology, and I love talking Brett's floods. So you've got me. You had me at Brett's floods. I think those are all very real challenges. I don't personally believe that this tax increment finance district, if created, would be the entire solution to any of it. It'll be key. And what West Linn lacks is tools. We have very few funding pots to be able to contribute to projects. And that's why things happen slow here. And I do think there's some really significant challenges with developing the topography between I-205 and the Willamette River is a little bonkers in places. And there's going to be places where things will never happen, I think. Mm-hmm. It's going to be very opportunistic. You do have amongst you, and I see Joel's hand up as well, maybe a follow along, but you do have amongst you Kevin Johnson, who has looked at this in pretty great detail, I think.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit, and I actually know Jim Edwards has a lot of experience with this kind of development work too, with waterfront sites, and so he can add to it. But this definitely has those difficult factors. Those factors being the site is basalt, it's rock, and so to build on that, to put in utilities, are you blasting trenches? Or are you building everything higher? How about parking? If parking's on the surface, but then how much development is going to be based purely on how much parking you can get, and if there's no option to go below grade with parking, which there isn't on this rock, there's a lot of complexities there. The utilities alone are a huge lift. The sewer, water, storm, they're mandatory. And then, and sad as it sounds, it like starts with streets, then it goes through utilities, then it goes through parking, then you get to talk about some actual development. So there's a lot of heavy lift for these sites. Now, to be fair, these could be absolutely stunning locations for people to view, people to live, people to enjoy. So there hopefully is a big carrot out there, but I think that there's definitely a heavy lift. I just accentuate. So when I'm talking about the site, it's the upland site that's really where all the mill parking happens right now. That's the site I'm talking about. I would jump in and say that the PG representative here could say that their land is really, it's really difficult to build down there. You know, a rickety road down to an 8-foot wide drawbridge. Start there, and then add floodplain and an amazing amount of cleanup of existing things. So there is huge lift there.
I think the next hand up was Joel, and then Pat, perhaps.
Thanks, John. So as you pointed out, some of this work that you outlined and the projects could eat up all the money, right, that comes out of this effort. So, of course, that raises two questions. What happens when you run out of money? And then how are you splitting that, making that very hard decision about, if there are other things and other parts that would help with development, how are you making a decision between how much of like a road improvement you're doing or a sewer improvement you're doing, or versus putting something over in a more developed area to try to encourage further development to increase the tax amount that's coming out of it. So I'm just looking for, you can't have it all, right? And you have to make some really hard decisions. And even what you have doesn't pay fully for some of these things. So what are those others? You didn't give me much hope for that. There's other sources there to finish the job. So what would those be?
I didn't mean to be too negative, and Kevin, I think, got really negative. Something is going to happen. Good things are going to happen. It's going to take time, and it's just going to take commitment. The community is going to have to work together to follow through on this to deliver what we want. So all of those, if there's a district created, once it has a boundary, once it has a project list, once it has a purpose, your city council will serve as the board of the tax increment finance district, and they'll be making those decisions. And the reason that's such a great idea is they're also in charge of all the other spending. So our SDCs, our street maintenance fund, our utility fees, working with the budget committee, they allocate all of that. And so you have the same 5 people making that decision and making the TIF decisions. They're able to combine it as effectively as possible, one would hope. I completely agree with you. Those are going to be some hard decisions. You've already learned from Elaine, TIF is a bit of a long-term play, or at least a medium-term play. You start saving up money to be able to target some projects, get some projects, hope they deliver results, and then you do more. Until you've got the ball rolling enough where you don't need to keep doing those infusions. And again, you can return the taxes to all the jurisdictions that need them. Before I move on to Pat, Elaine, did you have anything you wanted to add to Joel's question? Or is that good enough?
No, I think that's great. And I think always when we do tax increment areas, we are hoping to leverage the funds with other funding sources. And that is what makes that funding source work well, is if you can then start identifying. And sometimes if you have that other resource, it does move you up on other grant lists or other kinds of funding. If you say, well, we have X amount to put towards this, can we match that with you somehow? So that is really a helpful way. I mean, just your neighbor next door, Lake Oswego, did the Boones Ferry Road project through an tax increment area. They leveraged that actually with a GO bond. So the citizens voted to fund part of that road through a GO bond and fund the rest of it through a tax increment area. So that was an interesting way to put it together and to leverage that money and make sure that project got done.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Yeah, having a matching fund source is incredibly important when you're going to get state, regional dollars, federal dollars. They love to see that matching, and TIF could provide some of that along with other funds. Mr. McGuff, kept you waiting long enough. How are you?
Oh, I'm good. How are you, John?
Oh, fantastic. Much better.
Hey, I just wanted to share, we just experienced building a parking lot at West Linn High that has the same solid rock under it. And of course, we did a hard bid on it, but we did go back and poll the contractor about what they estimated the increased cost was. And it was about 25%. So if that gives you something to kind of gauge by, and that's because of the equipment they brought in. We didn't have to blast on this one. We did actually on the north wing at West Linn High School when it was built. But the equipment's gotten better and it increased the cost about 25%.
That's great information. I appreciate that. And that is a really similar kind of site and conditions and geology. Thanks, Pat. Did I see one more? Is there one more hand up? Oh, Jim, I see. I have to scroll up and down a little bit.
Well, I do want to make this a question. And Elaine,
For statements, because I don't have to answer them.
well, okay, this is a question. Well, I don't think you can answer it either, but Elaine's made reference to the amount of the portion of the revenue, the tax increment revenue that would be generated on a portion of the property. And I think you said north of 205. It was a third. So I'm really curious, and this is my question. What is projected off the waterfront in terms of revenue? It depends on how much development is projected to occur in the waterfront. And so I'm just curious as to what are the ratios in terms of north of 205 Willamette and the waterfront?
That's a great question, and I was prepared for the first part of that, which is the why. When we made the projections, based on an overall assessed value increase of 5%. So 3% is what the current assessed value of any property typically goes up every year. That's the limit by Oregon statutory provisions. So we're estimating that there'll be a 2% increased growth. So when we looked at just taking that Y out, they just took the assessed value amount, multiplied it by the 5% to see what amount that would actually take out, because that's how we made those initial projections. So whether or not that increased growth happens there or happens down on the waterfront, we weren't that specific. We took that 5% over the total amount of assessed value within the area. So we could also then look at the Willamette area and take that out and say, okay, so what do you have? But that then means that the park area would have to grow that extra 2% on its own with those parcels. So what we did was an overall growth. And I see there's a question on that.
Yeah, my question is basically there are a lot of tax lots down along Volp Street, through the ponds that were basically drawn like over a century ago, with no real attention to the fact that there are wetlands and floodplains and Willamette Greenway. So it's like, I guess my question is like, how much again of the total revenues are really kind of based upon building on tax lots that may be inappropriate for development?
So those tax lots at this point would have very, very, very low assessed values, or sometimes no assessed value if it's owned. So predicating development on those is not where we're seeing any of this growth. The growth occurs where there is existing potential for the true development. So there's no expectation that those wetlands areas or the pond areas are going to be part of that development.
Thank you.
And I will say, from my perspective, we don't have any expectation that the community would say we want those natural resource areas paved over and built. That is not the vision we expect to come out of the waterfront plan. We certainly heard loud and clear that riverfront preservation and wetlands and all of that natural habitat is very, very important. So I think Elaine's right on. When we did those initial financial estimates a long time ago, we made sure that our consultant did not assume much down there, because we don't even want to get into the business of implying that that's going to happen. The city has pretty strong natural resource preservation codes. The state mandates them to. So that area is pretty well protected. I think keep it in the boundary if you do this in order that you can take advantage of some opportunities. Maybe there's some trails that connect. Maybe there's a way to for tourists from one place to the other and make sure you can get through it. But 10-story condos on wetlands, not going to happen.
So Jim has another question.
Well, I would, I guess this is a statement, it's not a question. I would suggest that we as the city, explore the possibility of a high density development at the waterfront. And I'm not suggesting that you fill wetlands, but I do believe that because there's solid rock there, that you could build vertical development that would be fairly high density, and convert very low current value real estate to very high value. Now, I would encourage the city to and I shared some concepts with Kevin and with John, but I think that it would be a mistake for the city not to imagine something creative that didn't abuse natural resources, but took the opportunity to take advantage of the land that's available. Even though it's in terms of acreage is not very large, but in terms of the potential vertical opportunity and the views of the river and the falls, I think that there's tremendous opportunity available there. And that has not been captured in the estimated value because you assumed that low value land would continue to be low value.
Pat?
So tagging on to that, John, would that, if there were higher density occupancy along there, would that change the infrastructure? I mean, that has to come first. You know, the size of the water lines, the size of the sewer lines and all of that. If that were part of it, would it significantly change, or is the plan or the idea to size it to take whatever a private developer wanted to bring in?
Well, if the waterfront plan comes up with certain types of development or certain allowances in certain areas, then there certainly might be the need to amend our capital improvement plans to reflect it and provide for it. So if there is something like Jim just mentioned, and you need different utilities, either different location, different sizing, whatever it might be, then you got to go back. You know, once you come up with the vision, then you do the zoning, then you do this capital improvement plans, and then I think it all comes back to, your question comes back to this district really, or this possible district. Elaine can help us answer that one, but I think if you have the district in place, you can amend the project list. You know, if you replace 5-inch sewer line with 10-inch sewer line, you can do that. You just have to update the costs, and you do have some restrictions about what you can do in terms of the the maximum indebtedness of the district from what's adopted. So that's I think the main limitation, Elaine. Is that right?
Right. You can change. You aren't going to have the money to do that street for a while anyway. And so your visioning is going to happen, and you'll know more about whether what you have projected as the cost for that street is going to be adequate and the utilities. And then you can go in and fine tune the plan to accommodate for that.
I'm guessing Darren wants to follow on that answer because I probably got it wrong.
No, I was just going to point out that development will still be required to make some of the improvements. The TIF district isn't going to fund every improvement. If a development goes in and water lines or sewer lines need upsized, they will pay their fair share of that. Same with road, street improvements. They'll pay their fair share and might get reimbursed through SDC credits or something, but they'll still pay for part of the improvements. The TIF district doesn't pay for everything.
I think that's a really important point. It hadn't even occurred to me that folks might be thinking that. I think that's right. Development that happens will pay all the applicable fees and charges and everything. This is about funding the city side of infrastructure that wouldn't otherwise get paid for, or putting some of it in early so that you can recapture the money that the developer does pay. So there's a couple of ways to go about it. Let's see, Greg or Pat, if you were done. Or
I'd just like to tag on. You mentioned that the whole goal is for the city to put something in to attract people. And I think you're right on the money. If you get the infrastructure as a developer, they don't want to take a sewer line 2 miles. That'll stop them in their tracks. But if that infrastructure is there, now it becomes much more attractive.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I've just got a clarification question for Jim. Is the high development area that you're imagining like in the region around the old city hall, like above the paper mill?
Well, yes, but I think that there is potential for a reuse of part of the mill itself.
Right. Are you imagining
And
that
I
no longer
I don't envision there being cars taken down to that area. You would have a parking structure up the hill somewhere, and then you would just use pedestrian or elevators to get down to the lower level. Because there just is not enough horizontal space to do conventional transportation alternatives.
Interesting. Thank you.
Elaine, I think we can keep going. But it may just still be out.
Sure. Unfortunately, WebEx knocked me out of the meeting a little bit. So in terms of knowing input on the projects and the summary of that, John, you'll have to do that for me because I missed some of that. So did you get through kind of a summary of all the projects or talk through what?
I think so. I'm happy to take more questions about projects or categories of projects.
Okay, well, let's just.
We may be done with project for now.
Okay, let's move on then. Lynn was on the right slide then. Thank you on the diversity, equity, and inclusion input. So as part of our contract, the city asked us to provide input on diversity, equity, and inclusion for potential tax increment area. We hired Echo Northwest as a subcontractor to us to provide that information. They have recently hired a woman on their staff who is an expert in this issue, who is working with communities all over the West Coast on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Next slide, please. Next page. So I'll just go through some of their key points of things to consider when putting together a TIF plan and considering those DEI issues. So one was which types of projects can increase equity and inclusion for West Linn residents and local businesses. For example, affordability targets on if you're going to do any kinds of loans or develop any housing or anything like that. And do those projects achieve multiple benefits in the TIF plan? So we've all been talking about infrastructure and development, but what they're saying is also look at that through the lens of equity and inclusion. In revitalization area, the question is how can the city build in measures in advance of a reinvestment to protect existing residents and business owners so that you don't have displacement of those businesses? And how can the plan mitigate any displacement impacts of redevelopment of low-income housing or multifamily housing? So those are just kind of overall considerations. I don't think we're talking about redevelopment of low-income housing or multifamily housing at this point, but thinking about the Willamette area and the existing businesses is something that I think we will want to keep in mind if that area keeps in the boundary. And then on implementation is once a TIF plan is adopted, how will the agency ensure equitable access to those investment dollars? So just making sure that when you're investing money, you keep that DEI lens as part of your evaluation. Next page, please. And then once you're developing a TIF plan, do the plan projects help to achieve taxing district goals? So making sure that the taxing districts who have goals within the area, for example, TBF&R may want adequate street widths to be able to service any development within the area, that those things are considered and included. And then beyond foregone revenue for taxing districts, are there other and unintended consequences for those taxing districts? That I think that issue comes up mostly for a school district, and those unintended consequences typically, at least with the West Linn Wilsonville School District, are positive consequences of tax increment areas for two reasons. One is that any local option levy that they have, any increased value that they get to apply that local option levy to will get them more income. And second, that the school district has been dealing with for the last 10 or more years compression issues. And one thing that urban renewal tax increment financing does is help to reduce those compression issues for schools. And that is a very complicated topic on which we can send you some information. Nick Popenick, our finance person, is actually developing a small white paper on that for Wilsonville, but it details the issue of the West Linn Wilsonville schools. So as soon as that is ready and approved by the Wilsonville staff, we can send that out to you just so that you understand a little bit about that compression issue. Next page, please. And then how do or do TIF plan investments impact vulnerable populations? And are there indicators that can measure the impact and progress toward increasing equity? And is the city regularly collecting data that can help identify change? And I think this is something where TIF plans across the state have room for improvement, which is identifying metrics to be able to measure things so that we can answer these questions, not just in terms of we think or showing examples, but that we actually have metrics. And I know the city is also working with a DEI specialist that will help the city think about how you establish metrics. So this is something, if the plan actually gets adopted, that will be an important thing to think about in terms of being able to say what the return on investment is within that area and what the impacts are to different populations. Next page. So when we talk about, so I'm moving on, maybe we should just stop a minute and see if anybody has any questions about any of that DEI information before we move on.
While we let people raise their hands if they'd like to on this one, Elaine, I thought maybe I'd throw you a question too. Just thinking about, those are important issues. You all are pretty familiar with this area. There's a pretty small amount of housing in this area, for example. It's manageable for us to understand what we're doing and probably create some measurements and be able to have some very direct outreach to the folks who will be directly affected. The question I have for you, Elaine, is thinking about sort of what actually this committee is recommending to council. Let's say the committee thought that monitoring and tracking equity impacts was important, or any of the issues you just brought up in the last couple of slides. They could forward a recommendation to the city council in terms of adopting a plan that there be, and I don't know to what extent you've talked to this group about sort of what the plan actually is and what's in it. If it were to be adopted, if you have a TIF plan, could it have a section about equity impacts and about tracking our performance in that area? Or could the council, in adopting the entire district, say, these unintended consequences to other taxing districts are important to us and we want to pay attention to them? What would that look like, and how would you advise our group of volunteers here in what to be telling and informing the council?
I think that's a great question, John. And the truth is, this issue is just being touched in tax increment areas. It's a relatively new issue that tax increment areas are having to deal with. So adding language into the plan is not required by statute, but there are parts of plans that aren't required by statute, and the committee certainly could say, this is an interesting and important issue for us, and we would like to provide these recommendations, and that could be part of the plan. I know I worked on a plan in Tigard, the Tigard Triangle Plan. Cassandra was part of that too. And we didn't address those issues when we did the plan, but the city of Tigard got a huge Metro grant after that plan was adopted, and then put out an additional kind of appendix to the plan that addressed those issues. For that plan area, it was very relevant because they were planning on putting a lot of housing within the area. And so making sure that some of that housing was affordable and some of that housing actually met DEI inclusion standards was really important to them. But you can also think about DEI in terms of contracting. So if you look at who's building the roads and wanting to have DEI filters on how you pick contractors. So any of that, if this committee would like to make some recommendations on that DEI issue, we certainly can look at some language to include in the plan, or just look at including it in a recommendation to city council as it moves forward, and really coordinating that with what the city's doing on the city side itself, to make sure that whatever the city policies are that are being implemented also carry through to the Urban Renewal Agency. So it's a relatively new issue, and any input is greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I think that's right. And kind of what I was driving at is there's been a number of questions throughout this meeting on various topics, everything from geology to the equity topic we're just talking about. I think you as a committee are free to go into as much or as little detail in your recommendation to the council. Elaine, I believe this is true. Mm-hmm. Could be as general a thing as, we support this boundary, or we recommend this boundary change, or we recommend these types of projects, and we think an equity focus would be useful. Or you could get super specific and really drill down and create some exact language that you want to be included in a recommendation. So I think you have some options here depending on how much detail you want to get into in terms of forming this recommendation. Okay, enough from me. Pat, I think I saw your hand go back up.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, does the city already have an equity plan?
Well, yeah, I thought about breaking in while Elaine was talking and giving a little more context. I appreciate the question. We do not. We are in the process of creating this. I think it's very important. It's not something that the city has done in any organized way to date. We do, as Elaine mentioned, have a wonderful DEI consultant on board right now. We had an assessment done a year or two ago, and it just hasn't quite landed. I have heard pretty strongly from our own staff and from the city council. They want us to have this. I want to have it. So we don't have, I would love to have something where they have advice for us in creating new plans and policies, and this is how we're approaching it. We don't quite have that yet, so you guys are a little bit cart before the horse. So I don't have something that I can just easily offer to you in terms of what our policies are. By early next year, we should have quite a bit on that.
And just for the second part, Elaine, you talked about compression, and I actually have your memo explaining how compression works with the city of Wilsonville. I have to tell you, I am rapidly, it's like drinking from a fire hose. That out, and when you have to have an expert write a white paper on it, I know how complex that is. But in general, compression does impact districts' ability to collect taxes. And what I'm interested in, you mentioned in our last meeting, there may be funding sources at the state level to offset that.
Not compression.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, but not compression. They offset the permanent rate levy monies,
Okay.
but not the local option levy monies.
It doesn't change our position. We know that the city of Wilsonville is actually reaping some of the benefit of that in their 3 urban renewal projects they have, Coffee Creek, and I did reach out and talk to the county tax assessor, so I got the actual figures on what that dollar amount is. It doesn't change our position in any way, but I was interested in, I thought that's what I heard the last time at the last meeting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it doesn't. It's just the permanent rate levy to the state school fund. So the districts that are fortunate to have their voter approval for local option levies, those are not impacted by urban renewal in any new, and any new development that comes on, you'll get to apply your local option levy to that value. So it should give you more money. And for compression for education districts, you actually benefit from that because urban renewal shifts a portion of the general government $10 per thousand into the education part, and so and that's that white paper that will explain that better.
It's so complicated.
Yeah, but it actually benefits you if there is urban renewal that is helping shift some of those tax codes.
Yeah, and I don't need a deep dive into it. I misheard, and my ears perked up. I thought I got to ask you at the next meeting. So I apologize for the bird walk here.
Pat, I wonder if you were thinking about the way that the schools are funded, that the state makes you whole on a per pupil basis based on the existing funding for schools. And thus, it doesn't impact you like it does the rest of us overlapping taxing districts because of that methodology. But the state's income is impacted by every single urban renewal plan in Oregon. It decreases the revenues going to the state, so they have to offset that difference with other state funds to give you that per pupil amount that you're guaranteed. So that might have been what you were thinking about.
That's probably what she was trying to explain, and I just misheard it. So excellent. Thank you very much, Cassandra.
Greg has a hand up.
I just had a question about affordability. So I think like one of the characteristics of the Willamette neighborhood is that the houses are small. And it's one of the reasons that it isn't affordable. At least it used to be an affordable neighborhood before the recent price increases. But I wonder about whether there's a way to think about affordable housing without immediately going to multifamily housing. And thinking about the maintenance of the characteristics of this neighborhood, and requiring that a certain number of houses need to be smaller than 2,000 square feet, for example, which is kind of characteristic of many of the houses in the neighborhood. And I realize that the banks don't like that, but it seems like an important element in kind of thinking about inclusion, and particularly class inclusion, so that people who are working class or middle class actually are able to afford living in this part of West Linn.
Yeah, I think those are great points. The key thing for this project is the no impact on zoning, right? So we're not changing zoning, we're not changing the comp plan designation of any areas or allowed uses. But I think you could, circling back to what your recommendation to council would be on a TIF district, you could certainly raise the specter of housing affordability problems due to increased investment and make sure that that was paid attention to over time. And certainly a point that you'll want to bring back with our visioning project for the waterfront district. So Elaine, you were getting on to your...
Yeah, just connecting the projects back to those TIF investments. So the different timeframes that we looked at in terms of projections of TIF money. So if Lynn could bring that back up, that would be great. So again, when Nick's team did the assessed value growth, they did them based on a 5% assessed value increase, 3% from the existing assessed value, and 2% for new development, which means that between $6.8 and $7.5 million of new construction has to happen per year over the time frame of the area. And when we looked at duration, just to give the city information on the feasibility study, we looked at 20, 25, and 30-year TIF plans. Next slide. This goes back to the capacity summary that we reviewed quickly at the last meeting, but on a 20-year plan, the capacity would be to have about 19.3. It's the fourth row down of money to do for projects. In a 25-year plan, it would be 29.8 million. And for a 30-year plan, 42.1 million. So in looking at the projects and the costs of the projects, and looking at the capacity, that just lets you know that as we looked at those projects and their costs, that especially if you pick the Willamette Falls Drive project, and I think it was it 34 million, John or Darren, it's a big ticket number. That's going to take up a huge amount of the capacity unless you're ever able to leverage that money with some other money. So looking at other potential projects within the area, that is one of the determinations that we're going to have to do is typically urban renewal areas are between 25 and 30 years. A 20-year area it takes a long time for urban renewal to really get started. And so the amount of money that you're able to put together is relatively low. So there was no determination by city council on length of the area. And usually how we come up with that is look at the projects that are key to helping to incentivize development and seeing what those are going to cost, and then determining the potential length or duration of the area. Duration is not a requirement of the statute. Only the maximum indebtedness number is. There have been recent plans adopted where we have put duration in the plan, mostly at the request of TVFNR, who says if you're going to be taking our money, it would be really nice to know when you're going to stop taking our money, so that we know when we're doing our budgeting that that area will end. And Cassandra, you may want to jump in on that.
I think you sufficiently described it. It's just helpful for our planning efforts as we're, this is among potentially many existing and future urban renewal plans that impact our ability to, you know, pay firefighters and build stations. So we would probably be seeking that same kind of affirmation as far as plan duration for this plan.
So again, I asked our finance team to look at if this committee recommended taking that Y area out of the boundary, and the boundary will come up here again in a minute, that would reduce any of these projections by about a third. And my off the cuff estimate, so you can't hold me to this, would be if you took out the Willamette area, it would be about the same. So we can provide that information if the committee says, you know, we really don't think that area should be included. We can provide that information, but that would be my best guess. So next page, please. And this just shows again that amount of money over time that we showed last time, and that hopefully a tax increment area will increase the value within that area, and at the time that it ends, all taxing districts will receive more tax revenue and also have better facilities within the area. I see, I can't see everybody. I see that Jim has a question.
Well, I have an example that I'd like to share. That I was the project director at the waterfront in Vancouver for between 2015 and 2020, and at round numbers, there were 32 acres of Columbia River waterfront that were isolated from the city by a railroad track, and there was no utilities, there was no power, there was no sanitary sewer, there were no internal streets. But the value of that property in 2015 was probably $40 million for the 32 acres. And I would bet that today that assessed value is $1 billion or more. The opportunity to take advantage of the natural setting of a waterfront is tremendous, and I don't think that the calculations based on current values is going to give you a reasonable estimate of what the future tax increment will be if you just use the current uses and escalate that at 2% over the 3% normal escalation. So I just think it's important to reconsider that there might be a potential for much larger increment, and most of that would come from future development that probably wouldn't occur if we don't have a tax increment district that funds a portion of that very expensive infrastructure.
Yep, those are good points. Thank you. I can't see everyone. Is there anybody else who has a comment here?
Michael has his hand up.
Elaine, I have a question on the mechanics of the availability of these funds. And so does this work in such a way that that tax increment, those incremental funds go into a separate account and they can be drawn down as the actual tax is raised, or is the language around maximum indebtedness seems to imply that you're borrowing against those future funds, and so is that incremental tax revenue collateralized or serve as collateral for a bond or borrowing? And I'd like some clarity on that. Would be super helpful.
Sure. That's a great question. And it's really both. So some tax increment areas across the state just live off of and use their money that comes in annually off of the growth of the property taxes within the area. There is a requirement in the statute that you have to spend your funds after they become a debt instrument. So they typically will do like an overnight loan or overnight borrowing from a credit union or from their city to just make those funds debt and then pay that back and then just use that. Bigger areas where you're doing bigger projects. So this area, I would assume, would end up doing a borrowing at some point. So a bond that gets repaid through those tax increment revenues. And when you do that borrowing, you really can only do it once you have an income stream that is large enough to pay the debt service on the borrowing that you might do. In the financial scenarios that Nick puts together for us, he looks at that borrowing and looks at a 1.5 debt service coverage ratio. So the debt service coverage ratio just means if you have to pay $10,000 on your debt, you need to have an annual income of $15,000. So that amount plus 50% more. We use that as a very conservative. You may be able to place a bond where the lending institution or the bondholders will reduce that debt service coverage ratio, but that's typically what we look for in terms of looking at the projections. So as our steps will be to finalize a boundary and then to look at what projects, and then Nick's team will put together a finance plan that would show, okay, given the projected revenues, when might you be able to do these projects over time, given when you might have capacity to actually borrow funds. So that will be something that we would be able to look at depending on how many decisions we can get made today, or if we can get any of them made today. Nick's team is ready to jump in and develop. They have all the base information for that. They just need to know, is the boundary going to stay the boundary, or is it going to change, and what projects are we looking to do? And once we know what projects, we're better able to know how much money needs to be allocated to those projects over time.
That's clear. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I think if we go back to the PDF.
Hey, Elaine.
Yes.
It looked like Tanner Woody has a question. Hi, Tanner.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just can't.
No. I got you.
Okay.
I just put my hand up. I just wanted to let you know I have to leave a little bit early again today. So thank you all again for your detailed information, and I'm really happy about the progress we're making. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you attending. All right, that looks like all the hands.
Thanks, John. So next page, and I think the next page, let's look and see what it is. yeah, your input and any public input, but I'm thinking, Lynn, that after that, there's the boundary again, maybe not. And if not, we just need to go back to it at the beginning. No, yeah, clear, sorry, thank you. So I think that the issues that we've heard are both, should the Willamette district be included in the historic area, and should the Y area be included? And let me just give you some pros and cons really of both. The pros for including those are, if you want to keep supporting the Willamette district in terms of the investments that the city's made and consider other investments within that area, it needs to be included. That area also provides significant existing assessed value upon which tax increment proceeds will be earned to be able to help fund those projects within the area along the riverfront. And the Y area is pretty much the same issue. Is are there projects there that you want to do? And we do know that a significant amount of the projected funding will come from that area. And to be able to do a tax increment area, you typically do need some amount of base assessed value. As we said at the last meeting, in terms of the percentage of the city's assessed value, even taking in those two additional areas is under 4% of the total assessed value of the city. So it's a relatively low amount. So the cons would be whether you're going to do significant projects there or not, and should that area continue going to all the different taxing districts instead of helping to supply funding for the waterfront area. And I think that question really goes for both of those sub areas also. So I think we can take the map down, and maybe we just do a hands up survey of folks just to get some input on those two separate areas, on whether they think they should be included or not. Or John, you may have a different way you'd want to look at that.
No.
Or different pros and cons you want to
This is
add.
hands up.
Yeah, thanks. This is Darren. So looking at that map, I think the one recommendation from the group needs to be that to ensure that both sides, the entire width of Willamette Falls Drive is included in the boundary. Based on looking at that map, it looks like and the boundary along the north side of Willamette Falls Drive on a portion of it, and I think we want to include the entire Willamette Falls Drive if the projects need to be within the boundary.
And Darren, do you want to talk any more about pros and cons of including those two areas than the ones I summarized? Or John, or anybody else on the committee?
Oh, sorry, Elaine. No, I would just add that I was just quickly looking around the Willamette area, and there is a project that will be coming into the city probably in the next 6 months, where the assessed value of the two properties is about $400,000, and the development that happened adjacent to it has now got an assessed value of about $8 million. So that's one project that would definitely contribute to the value of the district. That's a pro.
Yeah. I think the other thing to think about is if there is a concern about negative impacts on existing businesses in terms of rents or leases going up, or the ability to help stabilize that can only be done if that's included within the urban renewal, the tax increment area. So that's a consideration if that's important to the committee. So why don't we go back to the people, and then John, if you can just ask for the two different areas and ask for a thumbs up if it's going to be included. And again, I can't see everybody, so maybe somebody can tally up the responses, and then that may or may not tell us something. We may need further discussion.
Folks game for that kind of approach? Okay. Let's see, Jim put his hands up.
Well, I just have a question for Elaine. So these are a large portion of the property that we're talking about is either blighted or undeveloped, or it may be used for an aeration pond, but I'm considering that undeveloped. So the increment is on the land value and the improvement value on the land. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so by taking just doing a 5% increase on the land value only, I don't understand how we're capturing the value of the improvements.
I think what we have to understand is we're using an average because we do not know exactly how that riverfront area is going to develop. So that visioning and all of that is not done. So we can't do actual like site projections and say, well, that's going to bring in X million dollars of value. So typically in tax increment areas, and I think, Jim, you have a good comment about the Vancouver one. I've always also worked on the ports side of that project. But the way, and we've been doing these for about 17 years, the way we typically do projections of value, if we aren't able to do site-specific projections, is an overall increase kind of compared to what happened. So yeah, this could be really low, but it's also saying, like in the Willamette district, if though there's a lot of existing buildings that aren't going to increase by that additional 2%. So that additional increase kind of gets spread throughout the area. So it's looking at that whole area and saying, well, we think that whole area is going to increase by 5%. And that amounted to, we had on one of the last slides about how many $1 million. It was around, I think, $7 or $8 million per year of investment. Well, that investment isn't going to happen just based on that 3% of those existing structures in Willamette. That investment is going to happen on that raw land. So that 5% is a factor and an analysis like we've used before in other areas, but it's not, it may not take into account full vertical development if that's what happens down in the waterfront.
Elaine, I had a question for you and Jim. As you've been involved in waterfront developments, I'm just curious about to what degree you're taking into consideration the flooding potentials tied into climate change with regard to atmospheric rivers and rain bombs. I have a friend who lives in Australia. The community that she'd grown up in had 2 500-year floods in a month with water kind of up to the eaves of houses. And this whole area has had like significant floods since 1861 on that occur about every 20 to 30 years. It's even though it's all kind of 100-year floodplain, the floods basically occur more rapidly than that. And so I'm just curious about the degree to which, as you do waterfront planning and kind of investment projections and tax revenue projections, you're thinking about climate change.
We are not. I mean, we have no ability to look at and project, okay, in 50 years, there's going to be a major flood that's going to do X, or like down in Talent, I've been working with them, a fire is going to come through and take out your whole downtown. We have no ability to make that kind of, and Jim, in terms of the development on the river, all of that, I mean, talk about the considerations made there on flooding or anything like that up in Vancouver.
Well, discounting global warming for a moment, when the high water level on the Columbia River in a 500-year flood is 29 feet, I think, above sea level, and the low water level in the Columbia is like 14 feet or something like that. So not a lot of difference. But in 2000, what was the big rain year? We had 2016 or 17. That we had water within a foot of the 500-year flood. So but to address a more specific example of the Willamette Falls, you're probably right, Greg, that the aeration ponds are in the floodplain, and even today, and certainly if there's a big change in the environment and we get a lot more rain, that area will be potentially flooded. But if you go up to 205, you're probably 100 feet or
Oh, yeah.
150 feet higher. So there's a big increment there between the highest level that the Willamette River's ever been and potentially the top of buildings that wouldn't interfere with anybody's view from up on Sunset, for example. So I think there's opportunity to go vertical and stay out of the floodplains. So that's the end of my story, so to speak.
Thank you.
On that topic.
So John, do you want to ask the question about each area separately, and we'll see what kind of response we get?
Sure, happy to do that. And I think my marching orders are first to ask about the area on the other side of I-205, whether you would recommend to council that this area be included in the district or not. So maybe a show of hands for those who think that it should be included.
Should or shouldn't?
Should.
Should.
All right. Help me out here, Darren. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can't tell what Cassandra's doing.
Well, I have this wishy-washy thing. So I don't feel it meets the definition of blight. I don't feel, same with Willamette, that it meets the intent of what tax increment financing, how it's supposed to be structured. But I also very much understand that in the absence of those areas, you're not going to be able to build the increment to do the projects. So can I just be neutral on it?
You can certainly be neutral.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I believe what I have is because I saw Joel pop in with a visual, so I believe I had 7 on the yes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 now with Joel.
Yeah, I count 8 also, John.
Okay, thank you, Darren. And so the remaining number would be how many, Darren? Can you look at that? If you think no, that it should not be included.
Well, I'm gonna take Sandra's position. I'm not a hard no, but I really think, based on the comments I've already made, that we should recalculate the revenues so that we're not depending so much on that revenue. So I'll take a no.
All right. So
8, 1, and 1.
okay. Question for the Willamette district, the Old Town district, and I guess I'm trying to figure out what exact question I'm asking. I believe maybe what I'm asking is the area That would be the area west of 10th Street, perhaps, is what we're asking. I mean, there's a lot of ways to define the question I'm about to ask, but maybe I'll start with that. So, which would certainly allow for the district to continue over 10th Street to 205. So if you would support keeping the Willamette District west of 10th Street in, so keep it in the boundary, raise your hand. Okay. What happened to, there's Joel. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then Cassandra, 9. Okay. And I guess Jim perhaps is the one who didn't vote on that one. So same as before.
Yes.
Okay. Fabulous.
One thought about that, Jim, is that if indeed a lot more development happens than is projected, the area could close down more quickly than the projected 30 years. So yes, it would maybe have underestimated the amount of revenue that could be raised to do projects, but given the maximum indebtedness, you know, if it was a lot faster than that, it would just close more quickly and get the money back to the taxing districts more quickly.
Well, I don't object to the idea. I guess I'm just, I want to be protective of the tax increment concept. So I'm supporting that. But I believe that I'm representing, or I'm suggesting that we not provoke the lion by inviting a lot of opposition to the whole concept.
I appreciate that. We have a couple of hands up. Maybe Michael first.
I think some of the discussion that we've had within our groups very strongly aligns with some of the statements that Jim has made. And so just one suggestion maybe that we could include in next week is this concept of how do we prioritize this money to do high impact projects where we're going to have the opportunity to have orders of magnitude changes in assessed value. And I think, you know, I think Jim raised some concepts along those lines, and potentially that could be something that we could discuss, including it in the guidance to council.
It's great. I love that. Thank you. And I recognize it's 4:54. We want to value your time. So we have a couple more hands up. Let's see, Greg.
Just quickly.
Joel and then Jody.
Yeah. Drawing the boundary to the west of 10th Street, would that then preclude doing anything about the property that's just to the east of 8th Court and the development there that's down below Willamette Falls Drive? Which is the one section of town that truly is blighted.
No, that would, if you removed Old Town Willamette, you could still keep that in.
You could, okay.
Yeah.
John, am I wrong? We didn't remove anything at this point?
Didn't remove anything at this point. The majority opinion was to keep the whole boundary bit essentially as is. Joel, I think, and then Jody. You there, Joel? You're muted.
Yeah, I was muted. All right.
You
I
are.
just want to make sure we're not going to skip over the equities discussion because we have a series of questions to consider. And, you know, if we're going to make decisions and recommendations, I would like to make sure we have that discussion next time. Really think it through for part of the recommendation going forward. So just a note to please come back to that one.
Yeah. I think the way we were seeing it, or the way Elaine was structuring it, was let's look at the boundary area, and that'll help us figure out everything else we want to do. Did I say Jody next? I think I did.
So I want to talk about the equity and inclusion as well. I think especially since the city doesn't have their own stance on it currently, I think especially the area across 205 from the Willamette area, the Y or whatever we're calling that area, now that people are supportive of keeping that in, I think that's very important because that is the one area in town where there's been a lot of discussion of adding housing. And so I think that it's very important for us to have that discussion since there have been multiple projects proposed over the last 10 years for that area that included housing. And so I think it's as well as other commercial. And so that's an area that I see a real potential for some redevelopment, which will potentially include housing that we really want to apply. I would like to see an equity lens applied to.
And another part of the district in the map that I'll point out, we never really returned to talking about it, is some of that housing that's happening right down by Broadway, A Street, and the Arch Bridge and Willamette Falls Drive. That's an area where I think we need to pay close attention as well.
Agreed. I think that's a really important area.
So Kevin is our last hand up, and if it's a less than 3-minute question and answer, we can get out of here by 5. No pressure.
Perfect. So if I'm tracking, is the projection to some degree, my sense is it's kind of a conservative estimate of potential income off of this. And if things are better than that and they grow to where there's substantially more income driven up by development, it isn't capped as far as how much can be putting into this, is it?
It is capped.
It is. So we
That is the cap. So we're projecting that. I don't have it right in front of me. So if you look at the 30-year scenario, that is the limit. So if more development happened, then the area would just close earlier. So yeah, I thought it was 89 million total TIF. If you looked at the 30 years, the net total TIF is a little over 89 million. So the maximum indebtedness would be 76 million. And that maximum indebtedness is the cap on the area. So if it takes 25 years to get there, you close it then. If it takes over 30 years to get there, unless you have a duration clause, and like I said, we've put that in some recent plans. So if it takes over 30 years, it just really depends on whether there's a duration clause within the plan or not.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Darren, what was the valuation of that neighboring building that you came up with? Not the raw land, but the neighboring building that had been built?
I think he said 8 million.
8 million. So just for people to think about, think about the taxes generated from an $8 million value. Think about how many of those you would have to have within this district boundary in order to generate $89 million. It's a lot of things would have to go right to generate that amount of money, I think, in this boundary.
You would have to have one of those a year. That's what that much new development a year. So you might get a bigger project that has more, but
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're at 5 o'clock. You have started creating a recommendation. The next meeting, it may be that you can get all the way through. I don't know. What I would really, really ask, and I appreciate Mr. Schwartz for doing this, is for coming up with questions, sending us questions, and allow us to be prepared. If any of you need information like that as you go into the next meeting, please reach out to me and Darren and Elaine, and we will do our best to make it available. Anything else, Elaine, or anyone wants to add on right now?
No, I appreciate all your input. It's really very helpful and very thoughtful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate you all. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.